Continuing this series, reading from The Courage to Heal, the third edition, talking about kind of the damage that the false memory syndrome foundation caused our society and culture largely in the 90s, and why it makes sense to push back against a lot of this stuff. Even though that foundation has been disbanded, a lot of those concepts are still seen when people come out talking about CSA. You'll still hear, oh, it's probably a false memory, or things like that. What we don't know about memory. There are many unanswered questions about trauma and memory, but whether traumatic amnesia exists is not one of them. By the way, this book is from, I think, like 94, so it's really old. So I'm sure we have updates in memory research since then, but even back then, we knew that traumatic amnesia was a very real thing and a pretty common thing. The fact that people experience amnesia for traumatic events is, or should be, beyond dispute. It has been documented not only in cases of child sexual abuse, but among war veterans, battered women, prisoners of war, and others who have suffered severe ongoing trauma. Psychotherapist David Kaloff, who has worked with more than 400 abuse survivors, explains, what stood out in many of these cases were symptoms common to other trauma victims, including survivors of such public horrors as the bombing of Dresden, the camps in, Small Mustache Man. I think TikTok is really sensitive about that topic. The massacred villages of Vietnam, Guatemala, and Bosnia. Like survivors of these public traumas, my clients had dissociative symptoms, such as sleepwalking and memory disturbances, as well as signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, such as flashbacks, sleep disturbances, and nightmares. They wanted to be anonymous or were socially withdrawn. They were depressed or had other mood disturbances. They often tended to minimize or rationalize painful present realities, and they suffered from feelings of numbness, emptiness, and unreality. Unlike the survivors of publicly acknowledged disasters, however, they did not know why they felt that way. Their memories of the traumas were often fragmented into bewildering mosaics or missing altogether. Often they were veterans of intensely private wars that had taken place in barns, attics, and suburban houses with blinds drawn. Their wounds were never reported in newspapers or discussed with family members. There were rarely any witnesses other than the people who had hurt them. Their childhood rapes and beatings were encoded into memory in fragments in a state of terror when their hearts and minds were flooded with adrenaline. They didn't remember them the way one remembers a walk in the park, and they doubted the fragments that they did recall. There is increasing documentation of traumatic amnesia specific to survivors of CSA. In the much publicized Father James Porter case, a Catholic priest admitted to sexually abusing between 50 and 100 children. As adults, many of these survivors experienced amnesia, including Frank Fitzpatrick, the first man to come forward. Psychologist John Breer and therapist John Conte studied 450 survivors, 420 women and 30 men, regarding amnesia for sexual abuse incidents. 59% of the survivors identified some period in their lives before age 18 when they had no memory of their abuse. Amnesia was the most common when the abuse took place at an early age, was extended over time, included multiple perpetrators, or was violent. Linda Meyer Williams, research associate professor at the Family Violence Research Laboratory at the University of New Hampshire, studied traumatic amnesia, interviewing 129 women who as children had reported sexual abuse and had been brought to the hospital emergency room for treatment and the collection of forensic evidence. At the time of the original abuse, the girls and their families were all interviewed, and information about the abuse was carefully documented. 17 years later, 38%, more than 1 in 3, did not remember the abuse or chose not to disclose it. In a study by psychiatrist Judith Herman and psychotherapist Emily Schatzow of 53 clients, most of whom had recovered memory of CSA, 74% were able to find corroborating evidence. Most of these got confirmation from family members who knew about the abuse. Some found diaries or photos, talked to other victims, or had perpetrators who admitted what they had done. In several instances, the perpetrator even tried to reinitiate sex. 9% found evidence that strongly suggested sexual abuse, but was not conclusive, and 11% did not try to confirm their memories. Only 6% could not find any supportive corroboration. In their ability to find corroboration, there was no difference between the women who'd always remembered their abuse and those whose memories had been repressed. All too often, recovered memories are substantiated through the discovery that a child is being abused in the present by the same person who abused the adult survivor in the past. Frequently, this tragic turn of events is the only thing that finally brings families to acknowledge that the adult survivor is telling the truth. As one survivor described, "I told my mother, I told my brothers, and I told my sisters-in-law. I'd screamed at them to keep my niece and nephews away from my father. They thought I was a raving lunatic. My mother believed me for about 2 weeks, and then she collapsed. She couldn't face it, and nobody did anything. And now it's too late. The kids have all been abused, and finally everyone believes me." This is not to say that memory is always 100% accurate. We know for a fact that it is not. Researchers Ulrich Neisser and Nicole Harsh, for example, found that many people were mistaken in their recounting of where they were and what they were doing when the Challenger crashed. None, however, were mistaken about the fact that the Challenger crashed and that the astronauts had died. So too in memories of CSA. It is inevitable that survivors will remember the details of their abuse with some degree of inaccuracy. Time sequences may be mixed up, multiple incidents may be telescoped into a single incident, whole portions of incidents may be missing, and the events before and after may be blurred. But the core of the memory, its emotional felt truth, has its own authenticity. One survivor explained, "There's a lot that I'm pretty sure I'll never have straight. After all, it began before I can remember. I mean, there's never a time before the abuse, so a lot of it is blurred, and I honestly don't think it'll ever come into focus. But I've gotten clear on the essentials, what I need to know to do my healing work and to get on with my life. I know the main cast of perpetrators. I know the extent of the damage. Maybe I'll get more bits and pieces as time goes on, but if I don't, it doesn't matter. The cards are on the table, and that is a relief." How could you forget something like that? Even though you may intellectually understand the relationship between sexual abuse and traumatic amnesia, you may still have trouble imagining that it's possible to forget something as significant as sexual abuse for 20 or 30 years. One survivor who'd always remembered her abuse vividly could not comprehend how someone could forget such violations. It was a struggle for her to believe the stories she heard from women who didn't remember their abuse until adulthood. She says, "Over the years, I've been to several support groups for abuse survivors and used to wonder about the women who are in the process of recovering memories of abuse. After all, I could remember all the abuse that I suffered. Why couldn't these survivors describe their abuse in the same vivid way? For example, I can recall the exact pattern of the dress that I was wearing at age 9 when my grandfather harmed me. Although I wanted to support these other women, I found it difficult. However, the day after I confronted my grandfather about his abuse, I remembered an incident that had happened when I was 5. It came back to me with the same kind of vivid detail that I've always recalled about the other times he hurt me. I now believe in suppressed memories, but I think it is very difficult to understand this phenomenon if you have not experienced it yourself." Memory and abusers. In all this debate about memory, much has been said about survivors' memories, but little about the memories of abusers. Since there are so many unknowns about memory, then why aren't those who claim to be falsely accused questioning their own memories of the past? As one survivor wrote, "It's perfectly rational to believe that parents who are abusive might repress the memories of the abuse and then deny it. Some of the anger I read in the parents' stories sounded like the anger of being discovered, rather than the anger of being accused of a wrong that they did not commit. Perpetrators have a strong and clear motivation to bury what they've done." Psychologist John Reid speculated on the probability in a letter he wrote to the director of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. "Recently, a man I was working with recalled an event in which he was the abuser, and it reminded me how much more of an incentive the abuser has to falsify memories. When I attempted to imagine having abused one of my children, I am filled with an anguish I can scarcely describe. It seems to me that the anguish associated with having been the betrayer has to be at least as great as having been the betrayed. The parent probably has already felt such deep and powerful love for their offspring that to integrate those feelings with an awareness of having betrayed the child would be difficult, to say the least. I expect that the parent would be particularly vulnerable to conjuring up a memory of a warm and loving relationship with their child, uncomplicated by memory of the abuse and betrayal. Many offenders were victims of child sexual abuse themselves. Their subsequent perpetration against children is sometimes a reenactment of what they themselves experienced. They may or may not be aware of their own childhood trauma or connect it to their abuse of children now, but the patterns of denial, repression, or even complete amnesia that help them cope with their own violation may limit their capacity to acknowledge and face their abusive behavior now. Most therapists who work with offenders observe that denial operates more frequently than actual amnesia when it comes to their abuse of children. But in some cases, the suppression of awareness is so strong that the offender really thinks he didn't do it. As psychologist Brian Abbott explains, most offenders are aware of what they're doing while they're committing the sexual offense, but there's a feeling of disgust, shame, and guilt associated with it. In order to preserve some feeling of self-worth, the offender forgets what he has done. By not remembering, he doesn't have to be faced with the disgusting, shameful feelings about his behavior. Some offenders literally bury it in their mind to the point where they're not consciously aware of it anymore. In light of this, it's easy to see how even those whose perpetration has been clearly proven could still continue to believe in and proclaim their innocence. There will be a part 7. We'll get into the controversy of sadistic ritual abuse. So follow me if you want to catch that.